Well, I'm so glad that Richard Buxton, Francis Reynolds, John Eekelaar, and Ruth Deech have agreed to sit at the front and say a few words about, actually, this is the Oxford Law Faculty, so they get to say a few words about anything they want to. But we're interested not simply in the bricks and mortar, which I find extraordinarily fascinating, but also on the library, not only on the library and the building, but the law faculty, and not only the law faculty, but law in Oxford. In 1964, in the 60s in general, and since. And I would love to say something. I'm going to try to restrain myself, but bear with me before I introduce the panelists, because I want to just mention some other people. To say welcome to all of you, and I wish I could introduce each of us to the other, and not being able to do that, I did want to introduce Lorna Carter to everyone. Lorna's husband, Peter Carter, was the moving force in the process that you've heard about from Elaine Harwood, by which the law faculty, here Lorna's waving, by which the law faculty attained some useful facilities in the St. Cross building. And we're all in Peter Carter's debt in that respect and in others. And I'm delighted that Lorna, who has worked with us on the law faculty in the St. Cross building in the 21st century as well, is able to join us for this discussion. In 1964, this day in 1964, we had representatives from the Law Society and the Inns of Court, and I think Sir John Mummery is here. Yes, Sir John is here for the Council of the Inns of Court, and Jonathan Smithers, Vice President of the Law Society. Delighted that you can be here with us today. I want to mention some benefactors. You know that we're in debt to the Gulbenkian Foundation, and Elaine mentioned the Rockefeller Foundation. And I actually appreciate the brass fittings on the desks in the Bodleian Law Library, but I feel actually quite intensely about the value of what benefactors did in 1964 and do today, not because of the brass fittings, but because of people. And there are people in this university, there are students in this university that wouldn't be here without the generosity of people who provide private support to the university. And I have colleagues who are terrific, who would not be here without private benefactions. We have with us today Tim Parks from Herbert Smith Freehills, Emma Matabalavu from Clifford Chance, Louise Lamb from Hogan Lovells, Oliver Brettle from White and Case, Piers Pritchard Jones from Freshfields, Matthew Tobin from Slaughter and May. Those people are part of the Law Faculty's Development Council, a group that works with us on funding for pushing back the frontiers of stupidity in our discipline that is not available from public sources. The British government is still our largest supporter, and it's just one supporter, and we don't expect the British government to enable us to do what we aim to do. I'd also like to pay tribute to John McCall McBain, an Oxford Law alum. Where is John? I've seen him this afternoon, so perhaps he'll join us later. Oh, he's had to go. Okay, then let me tell you that single law alumnus has not merely contributed to the Rhodes Scholarships, but effectively re-endowed them for the 21st century on the scale of Henry VIII, but without that tyrant's vices, and we're grateful to him. And I just want to mention some regrets. I wish Harvey McGregor could be here, but he wasn't able to. I wish Geoffrey Hackney could be here. This is ridiculous. He's at a Wadham College event, and that's the sort of clash that you run into in Oxford. But even more extraordinary, let me read you a response to the invitation. Thanks for your invitation. John Gardner and I have our first class on that Friday at 5 to 7, so I can't come to the panel discussion. But you might mention that there is someone in the faculty who was in the planning of the St. Cross building, likes the building, and has used it continuously from 1964 to the present, and is still teaching. All good wishes, Tony. That's Tony Honore, giving a BCL seminar in All Souls at this moment. This is an amazing place. I'm glad that he's teaching on the BCL instead of coming to a panel discussion. But I'm also delighted to be able to be part of the discussion, and I'm grateful to these people for coming to say a few words. Richard Buxton was a Don at first a lecturer at Christchurch and then a Don at Exeter College, and a CUF lecturer in the faculty from 1964. Went to the bar in 1973, was a law commissioner, appointed to the High Court in 94, the Court of Appeal in 97, and retired in 2008, and he's an honorary fellow of Exeter College. On the Westlaw database, it took me a while, but I counted 1,091 Court of Appeal decisions involving Lord Justice Buxton. They start in 97, they don't stop in 2008, they continue to 2013. I don't know where they might continue further.
I hope you didn't check the record in the Supreme Court.
I'm working on it. And they reflect a phenomenal record of service to this country. Across criminal law, procedure, sentencing, commercial law, property, landlord and tenant intellectual property, immigration and asylum planning. He's one of the Oxford lawyers who makes a mockery of the distinction that people draw amongst people as public lawyer or private lawyer. And I'm delighted that you can be here, Richard. Francis Reynolds is an emeritus fellow of Worcester College and an emeritus professor of law in the university, a doctor of civil law, fellow of the British Academy, an honorary bencher of the Inner Temple, and the legendary author of Bowstead and Reynolds on Agency, and of many other works, parts of Chitty and Benjamin's Sale of Goods, co-author with Sir Gunter Treidel of Carver on Bills of Lading, and of course editor of the Law Quarterly Review from 1987 until this year. And I'm delighted that Professor Reynolds could join us. John Eekelaar was a student of King's College London and came here for the BCL in 1963. It took 2 years if you came from elsewhere, and held a Rhodes Scholarship for those 2 years and received the Vinerian Scholarship in 1965, and was a tutorial fellow at Pembroke College from 1965 until 2005, at which point he became academic director of the college. And I, when I was first working for the faculty, discovered in working with John in his various roles in the Conference of Colleges that it's possible for colleges and the university to work together. And he is also a fellow of the British Academy and continues as a co-director of the Oxford Centre for Family Law and Policy. Ruth Deech was principal of my college, St Anne's College, from 1991 to 2004. She had been fellow in law at St Anne's. She's now chair of the Bar Standards Board and a crossbench peer. Ruth was the first independent adjudicator for higher education in this country, and was chair of the UK Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, has been a governor of the BBC, a member of the Jewish Leadership Council, a Rhodes trustee, a founding trustee of the Mandela Rhodes Foundation, and is an honorary bencher of the Inner Temple, and has a connection with the interest in architecture in the university, because there's a rather striking building at St Anne's College called the Ruth Deech Building. Ruth, I'm delighted that you're here too. So with their indeterminate brief, I will hand over to our colleagues, but we do hope that you people will be involved in the conversation. Richard.
Right. I read law here from 1958 to 1961, then did the BCL in 1962. The most striking thing, I think, about undergraduate law was how many people were doing it. The year I took schools, 1961, 230 people sat the law school, which meant that there were something like 700 undergraduates reading law during that period. To accommodate these 700 earnest seekers after truth, at least some of them were earnest seekers after truth, they had in the first instance, and in some cases the only instance, their college library. College libraries varied in their holdings. Most, though I think not all of them, boasted a set of law reports. The 5 women's colleges made use of one set of law reports for the 5 of them, and a smattering of journals and what have you. Then there was the Bodleian Law Library, which was then located on the first floor of the old Bodleian building, where the catalogue room now is. It had 60 seats, and there was sometimes quite a long queue in the morning, not only to get a seat, but to lay one's hands on the one copy, and one copy only, of 1932 appeal cases. And that was really it. It had no American material, needless to say, nor did it have any Commonwealth material. The university, in fact, had a very good holding of Australian, New Zealand, Canadian and South African law, but because it was assumed that you would only want to study those jurisdictions if you were, in fact, an Australian, Canadian, New Zealander or South African, those books were all kept in Rhodes House. So if you were reading in the Bodleian, and by some unlikely chance you wanted to look at a Commonwealth authority, you had to flog through the rain to South Parks Road to pick it up. There were other drawbacks about the Bodleian. It had fairly restricted opening hours, quite apart from the pressure on space. And certainly in the year that I did the BCL, I worked, I think, entirely in my college library. That had the advantage that you could leave your books out overnight. It was open 15 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it had the law reports, a reasonable selection of textbooks in English and Roman law, the major journals, and a copy of the digest. And in those innocent days, that was all you needed in order to become a perfectly well-rounded lawyer. Now, it was very unsatisfactory that there was this emphasis on colleges, because it meant that lawyers in one college very rarely set eyes on lawyers from other colleges, and to the already inward-looking nature of the law course was added the inward-looking nature of the college system. And it also meant that although this setup was enough to get one through the syllabus, there were really no facilities for research at all. No doubt something had to be done, and it should not be assumed that there was enthusiasm in all quarters for the study of law to move from a college to a university base. People in those days were very suspicious of things that the university set up. The great fear was that the professoriate would take over, something that ordinary Oxford dons couldn't possibly contemplate. So it was an enormous achievement that Oxford managed to create this building and this faculty. It was not an obvious thing to happen. It was an enormous achievement, and Francis Reynolds is going to tell us a few things about how it happened.
Well, I joined this faculty in 1958, having done schools in BCL at Worcester and spent a year in America, which was quite a common thing to do at that time, because Professor Lawson had some arrangement with the University of Chicago and also Northwestern University to send people there. We were supposed to teach the Americans how to write, but we're younger than most of the Americans, so I'm not quite sure how good we are at it. We started off in the Bodleian in the 50s, which was, in the Camera, which was very bad indeed. We then moved into the lower library of the Bodleian, which was actually quite good, but there wasn't nearly enough space. Two conspicuous figures there were Professor Tritle, I'm glad to see here, who was writing his book, published in 1962, and Professor Michael Firmston, as he now is, who conducted a sort of advice centre for Exeter undergraduates during his third year and his BCL year. In the end, they raised the money for the library. The project started in the late 50s, and a committee, a group, was sent to look at American law libraries, consisting of Sir Humphrey Waldock, who was quite instrumental in this whole project, Sir Jack Butterworth, who became Lord Butterworth, who was the bursar of New College at that time, and Mr. Brian Campbell of the University Officers, who later became bursar of Corpus. In the end, the money was raised and the project went ahead. And there were some very generous donors who we had referred to already. I would also add A.L. Goodhart, who I think paid for the notorious brass lamps and tables and things, which we've had referred to, which I think was very generous. People representing the Inns of Court will be pleased to know that the Inns of Court, between them, gave £250 to the appeal. And asked for 4 separate receipts for £62.10. There was a change of architect, and we now have the building which we have always been very pleased with and is a great success. Now, I remember John Morris saying to me, must be the day before, I suppose, the library became generally available, I'm really looking forward to going and doing my work in the library tomorrow for the first time. The undergraduates were actually admitted into this in the second week of the term, as the Mr. Peter Clark's memoir in that book says. Then the SPTL, now called the SLS, Society of Public Teachers of Law, had a visitation to it, followed by a dinner in Wadham, which I went to. And I thought the menu had been composed so as to refer to members of the faculty, because I noticed Gatto St Honore. But I didn't find any more, and Derek Davis, who's got the menu, said no, there aren't any more. I was hoping for hot cross buns. Then there was the formal opening here by Dean Griswold. He first got an honorary degree. We then had a lunch in All Souls, and then he came down here to make a speech. And I was allotted to look after a man called Mr. Fred O. Dennis, who was, I think, a lesser American law publisher. And after we'd had the lunch in All Souls, I said, well, we now walk down to the library. He said, oh no, we need a cab. And started hailing cars passing down Cat Street, which you could at that time, cars could have at that time come into. And I persuaded him he had to walk. The lunch itself was the cause of amusement in the faculty, because Peter Carter said at some board meeting, Bodleian is treating this as a function, this opening, as a function for librarians and not for the law faculty. So they've invited all the librarians in the British Commonwealth or something of that sort. And then people said, well, there'll be some spaces for the faculty, won't there? He said, yes, but not many. And he was pressed, how many? Rather few. Pressed a bit further, very few. And he finally said, 2. And that's how I'd looked for a bit, but luckily the librarians around the Commonwealth did not all come and left quite a lot of space for members of the faculty, and more or less everyone, even including me, who was very junior at that time, got in. Griswold made a speech from this rostrum introducing the whole library, and he gave a list of famous members of the Oxford Law Faculty with which someone had supplied him. I shouldn't think he knew that many, but someone supplied him. But Edwin Slade was a fellow of St John's College, was very annoyed indeed that he didn't mention Holdsworth. I think a defect in this building is that it only had originally a small box in the middle with no windows for undergraduates to use a coffee machine. That's all there was. There was a graduate common room, not very big, but undergraduates just had that. And the view was that they should be in their colleges. They shouldn't be having things here. The Rockefeller trustees wanted to provide a cafeteria, which would have been a good idea. And now we've got one next door. But after some rather inferior arrangements in the OTC opposite. But that was not thought suitable. The room that they were allotted is actually now used for brooms and cupboards and broom cupboards, washing, floor polish and that sort of thing. The law board used to meet in All Souls in the Wharton room, which is very unsatisfactory. Professor Waldock got us moved to another new room under the hall, and we all went and had one meeting there, and there was the most dreadful noise as if one was in a ship. And so someone proposed we should go to the new room in the St Cross building, which had been prepared for the law board. And Waldock, I think, was rather annoyed, and I remember Peter Carter saying, I didn't think the case for moving would be so strong as at the first meeting. But it certainly was because of the noise. There was another event when the music faculty was thought to begin to move in next door, and this was instead of the Institute of Economics and Statistics, and this was resisted very strongly. And I remember a meeting in here where members of the faculty came to listen to see if they could hear music through that wall over there. And I remember Professor Wade saying, I think I hear Mozart. Anyhow, they didn't come here. The booklet that I hope you've been given, that's available anyway, contains a number of stories, and I can confirm two and tell you one. The two I can confirm are, firstly, there was a man, you get these in many libraries, who wore a dark suit and used to come, had nothing to do with the university, and used to come in and work on, I suppose, some sort of grievance. And he came in over and over again and carried briefcases and things. At one time, when he was going out, for some reason, he actually kicked the glass door and was very severely injured. So we then carried him into the SCR and called for an ambulance. And when he got there, he said, well, at last I've got into the SCR. There's also a reference to, we have corrals upstairs, which are rather like American saloon, have things like American saloon bar doors you can get underneath. And there's a mention in those papers of somebody who used to nip under them if he hadn't got his keys. And that's true. I asked him to confirm it the other day. That was Derek Davis, Fellow St Catherine's. He used to nip underneath and slide along the ground. The other one that I remember, which is not recorded anywhere, was Bernard Rudden's computer. Professor Bernard Rudden was an early user of computers, which he put into the typing room. The typing room was no longer used for typing and available for computers, and he put his in. It was a large, in the fashion of those days, old-fashioned thing with a very feeble printer and so forth. And but there was one time when he was sitting typing away on his computer, and smoke began to come out of it. And he looked puzzled and tried switching things off and so forth, but the smoke actually increased. And he got more and more alarmed and thought he'd better go and raise the alarm about his smoking computer. But what it was that there was some sort of minor fire in the basement of the building, and the smoke was coming up through vents. And one of the vents debouched beside his computer, and that's where it came from. The other thing I ought to do, I think, is reinforce Richard Buxton by saying that we all owe this to Peter Carter, who virtually did it as a one-man job. He defeated the first architect, got the second architect, supervised the building, and so forth. He was a very fierce defender of the integrity of the building. The original architect had not put any rails on the stairs outside, which made them very slippery when there was ice. But he wouldn't do it because it wasn't on the original drawings. Eventually he did, but he put them halfway down on one side and the other halfway down the other side. And I said, what's this for? He said, well, you've got to cross over and go down the other side. That's luckily much improved. And but he was very keen on preserving the integrity of the design, and what he'd think about the present proposals, I don't quite know. But I'm sure that we owe him a great deal. Si monumentum requiris circumspice. Thank you.
Right. Well, I don't actually have an awful lot to say. There are certainly people here who I'm sure would have much more to say and memories than I do, and I hope that they will talk a bit later. What I can say is that on two fronts, I mean, this building was, when it was established, was the beginning, I suppose, of a process of centralization, movement from the colleges to the centre, which sort of has come almost fitfully over the years, but it was the beginning. It started, of course, with the books, the library, but also the teaching centralization. And now, with administrative centralization, having met just before coming here the present dean in his office, just over there. I, of course, remember the time, as we do at this sort of stage, when, of course, we did have the law boardroom, which was just up there, which was rather grand, but effectively no other offices. There was a tiny office where there was a secretary. There was certainly no office for the chairman of the board, the equivalent of the dean. There was no such thing. And the basic administrative support or service was still in Wellington Square. So we had this sort of, I had to sort of run through Wellington Square and up. It was just, it gave you a lot of exercise, but that's how it was. Now we find that so much now more is centralised here, and you can see that in a collegiate university like this, that this would create tensions. I mean, quite genuinely, and people, actually try to resist, in a way, making it too attractive for students to come up here, because they really did think they should be in the college. And you can see in a collegiate university that there would be quite a strong base of support for that sort of feeling. As for myself, as Timothy said, I did my undergraduate degree in London, so I was never an undergraduate here, so I had none of that experience. I did, though, the BCL here, which was a bit different. I had to do it in 2 years. That doesn't mean to say that we did it more slowly or whatever. We actually did more subjects. We actually had an extra exam. We had it was in part 1 and part 2. And there were some interesting subjects in it. But it meant that because it wasn't yet centralised, I was sort of doing all this running around, which Richard's spoken about, even for as it were, university, and most stuff was, as it were, university taught, because it was BCL. So, apart from lectures, there were some centralised lectures, obviously, but they were in the examination schools. So people would go there and hear the big stars, like Herbert Hart. And one of the advantages of that was that if you were there, you might also pick up or attend a lecture by some other great star. I remember going, I think, to a jurisprudence lecture and seeing that the next one was going to be by Isaiah Berlin. So why wouldn't one go? Which, of course, people did. And that was one advantage of that sort of centralisation. As for the rest, I did sort of beat my path around the colleges. I remember going to, there were seminars by Harold Hanbury in All Souls, in Equity. There was, of course, John Morris, latterly with also Otto Confreund in Conflicts in Magdalen. I was very lucky to have, that was in Conflicts of Laws, I said, Otto Confreund himself, whose lectures I attended when I was in London. He lectured there in labour law at LSE, but I went to those. But I was extremely privileged because he put on a course called Comparative Divorce Law of England, France and New Zealand. And I was the only person, I think, who ever took that course. And we had really more or less just discussions in his rooms in Brasenose, and that was wonderful. I mean, to me, it was probably the greatest academic experience of my life. He treated me really as an equal. Why he should, I don't know, but he'd just order up the tea and sandwiches, and we would just talk. There was Bill Wade in St John's, and he gave a course on town and country planning. Which was unusual, but that was the course, and we used to go to St John's for that. The one top memory I have was John Barton at Merton. I think a lot of people who were around then might have memories of him. But he did give a course of lectures once, and I don't know where it was on the syllabus, but they were headed Disasters in Law Reform. With a friend of mine, we were so intrigued, we thought we'd better go to this. So we went, and it was in Merton in their little lecture room there, and we sat there and waited for him, and when time came, he didn't come, and after about 5 minutes we said, well, we're going to stay, we're not going to go. He did turn up. He looked at us, and I said, it was, damn, and after, stay there. And he went out and came back again with a whole sheaf of notes and started to talk on something I did not understand. It was something about Roman law, but I don't think it had anything to do with law reform. I don't know. Anyway, we completed the lecture, but we didn't repeat the experience. That was anyway, that's as far as, I mean, all that went with the centralisation here of Deech. Not complete centralisation, of course, as you know, and certainly not for tutorials. As far as the library is concerned, the one thing I did want to just say a quick word about was it made a number of things possible, and one of the things in the early days it made possible was the compilation, and this went on for, I think, 12 years or so, of a publication called the Annual Survey of Commonwealth Law. And I don't know how many people ever know about it or even looked at it or whatever, but it was made possible by the fact that the Commonwealth materials were released from Rhodes House or whatever, and all brought here. And this was a project which was funded by, or supported by the law faculty, by Butterworth's, and by the British Institute of International Comparative Law. And they appointed somebody, I don't think it was full-time, I think from his name was, he was a military man, Commander Cryer, yes. Naval man, yes, okay. But what I think he did, and I think he had some assistance, is they looked at all the materials coming in over the year into this library and noted sort of cases and legislation on little slips of paper, which was sort of about that big. And somebody typed the name of the case, and I think it was about it. And this was, it was then divided into subjects, and members, it was mostly members of the faculty, I think, but some were not, spent a lot of the summer with these. You had your pile of stuff. I did family law after a couple of years. And we just went and read the stuff which had been given to us and noted it and so on, and wrote these chapters. Well, I did mine, but as I say, many members of the faculty did theirs and their subjects. And I think, quite possible, at least it was said, that some of these things were some of the best things some of these people ever wrote. It was certainly said, I think it was certainly said of Derek Davis, that his chapters on, I see Roger is nodding, and he should know, but not my subject, but I think even I read some of them. I mean, it was just wonderful. And actually, when you think about that, the idea of actually, and these were summaries, they weren't, I mean, I think people did try to make proper thematic and critical sort of, at least they obviously varied, but that's what we tried to do, of the corpus of Commonwealth law. Not a silly idea, actually. Not a silly idea. I mean, now it's a bit out of date, and it stopped in 1977. For what reason, I don't know. And the whole scholarship scene has changed, and there are all sorts of reasons why that's probably just not on. But it doesn't seem to me to be a bad thing, but it was certainly made possible by this library. And I'll finish by saying that I did my last family law one in 1975. The next one I did jointly with Ruth. And then you did the one after it yourself. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Well, as Richard Buxton said, it wasn't just the opening of access to books and to a wealth of international and historical material that we've never come across before. It opened up the student body to each other and to the faculty members whom we saw coming into this building, undertaking apparently the same sort of work that we were doing. And it made for the feeling of a student body, because the men's colleges, though not the women, mostly kept their tutorials in college, so there was some segregation. I didn't know a law library was opening in my third year. I'd used the old bod for 2 years. We came back and found the books weren't there. And after some inquiry, we discovered they were here, and we went off to find the new library. There was no induction or information, you just got on with it. But what a change. Finding myself today as the only woman on the panel, this brings back early days as a student. I came up in '62, and nothing much had changed since 1953, which I mention because Anne Smart wrote a memoir of that date. 4 of us came up to St Anne's in '62, and I think in the whole year there were about 10 women and about 150 men. For the first few lectures in schools, the boys, they wouldn't sit next to us, they wouldn't sit in the row in front, and they wouldn't sit even in the one behind. We were left sitting in a kind of space in the middle. But in St Cross, eyes locked across the room, those wide open spaces. Fingers met fumbling for those little slips that went on the shelf. And many a marriage took place, I know for a fact. Now, at St Anne's, we had the benefit of the really excellent Geldart Law Library. And in your third year, there was also the Codrington, so we weren't short of books, but you could feel isolated if you didn't do something about it. There was no direct discrimination, but there were certainly some tutors who still gave you the feeling that women were surplus to requirements. Now, John Barton, it wasn't funny actually, he completely neglected his duty as a tutor. He turned up late with his huge dog, apparently called Montague Burton. He gave out lecture lists in Roman Dutch, knowing that we wouldn't read Afrikaans. And I just did the whole of my Roman law from a book that was much frowned upon called Liege, but it did get me a beater of sorts. I was taught by some marvellous people, and because we were sent out, our home tutors found the best. I had Brownlee, I had Jeff Hackney, whom we thought was an old man, though he must have been about 24. We had Maurice Cullity, we had John McMahon, we had Roy Stewart, we had Ron Maudsley, and I remember him saying to me, "What is a fee simple?" And a few years later, I had a student from Hertford called David Panic. And he came for the first tutorial, and I looked at him and I said, "Mr. Panic, what is a fee simple?" And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I thought, my God, this boy is cleverer than me. And he knew it. He knew it. We had Waldock, who was always saying, "I said to the ICJ the other day." It was very impressive. And we went to lectures by Hart and Cross, whose reader was Belinda Bucknell, now Belinda Bucknell QC. And Dauber, who had a bit of a partiality to sexist jokes. Do you remember Mens Rea? I remember Mens Rea. And of course, we went to Professor Tritle and Professor Morris. We wore gowns. We were addressed as Miss. We drank sherry occasionally. We went to Brian Simpson's lectures because he was so funny. And we went to David Yardley because he was so good looking. What is missing in all the lists that I've been given for today are the women tutors, the pioneers. Starting with Ivy Williams, the first woman to be called to the bar, and she was in the first group of women allowed to graduate in 1920. And I think I did clap eyes on her briefly when I was at St Anne's, but I didn't realise the significance of it. When she was called to the bar, the Law Journal editorialised, I quote, "In the divorce court, the presence of women as advocates might be a serious hindrance, not only to their male opponents, but to the judge. Their admission to the bar is never likely to be justified by any success they will achieve in the field of advocacy." When I was up, and in my early days as a tutor, there was no Sex Discrimination Act, and applications by women for pupillage and articles were routinely turned down on the ground of sex. "Dear Miss So-and-so, we don't take women, full stop." Membership of the Law Club for tutors was men only until about 1980. And when I was interviewed for my job in 1970, the shortlist was Anne Smart, myself, and Albie Sachs. Anne went to St Hugh's, and I was joined on the faculty later on by Anne de Moore and Anne Kennedy. In my time when I started teaching, there was Elizabeth Thornycroft, who wore jodhpurs for no reason that I understood. Just before I came up, there was the legendary Elizabeth Ely, who was married very briefly to Peter Carter, and she died tragically. Peter Carter was my moral tutor, until we got Cathy Ainsley, who we were told was the best brain ever to come out of Perth, Western Australia. She was a beautiful, beautiful blonde, and our tutorials were overshadowed by her burgeoning romance with Robin Day, whom she subsequently married. And we had Barbara Lillywhite, later Barbara De Smith, who was the first tutor who ever indicated to me that I was any good. In my third year, I wrote an essay, and she said, "Ruth," she said, "that's quite good." And my life changed. And of course, we had Hazel Fox. Did we get intellectual stimulation? Well, there were no human rights, there was no equality law, there was no European law. Judicial review was in its infancy. What we discussed and studied was only dimly related to the great issues that appeared just a couple of years later, like abortion, capital punishment, suicide, homosexuality, divorce, labour law, and so on. There was much too much Roman law and sale of goods, which I can't bear to this day. And the syllabus was dominated by jurisprudence. We had Hart lecturing on the concept of law. We deconstructed Denning, now that was fun, Hofelt, Kelson's Grundnorm, and Margaret Higgins, now Lady Wilson, her husband's in the Supreme Court, used to amuse each other by drawing little pictures of Grundnorms. We had American realism, C.K. Allen, John Austen, Maine, the Hart-Devlin dispute, and Fuller. We grappled with Marshall and Moody, some problems of the Constitution which we never resolved. And then, by serendipity, in college one day, I found Wolfgang Friedman, Law in a Changing Society, when I was looking for something else. It opened my eyes, and suddenly everything makes sense. Sadly, Wolfgang Friedman was murdered by thugs in Harlem, a few blocks from his university, Columbia, a few years later. The only issue I had with the library then, and even more so when I started teaching, was that it seemed always to be closed. When I was a mother of a young child, the only time I had to do research in the days before the internet were evenings and weekends, and it was shut. And you couldn't do anything without the journals and the reports. But the library must have had a good effect. The year's results after it opened included Beecham, Andrew Longmore, Neil McCormick, Michael Beloff, Giles Henderson, Ian Carston, Colin Lowe, Martin Paisner, Razzle, David Ambrose, Grafton Green, Henriques, Hodge, and Chambers. The third class, I've still got that little cutting from the Times, the third class in my year was an entirely public school. The year after was even better. Barrett, Paul Davis, Richard Epstein, who went to Chicago, Dyson Hayden, Nick Wilson, Boney, Ogus, Ted. The examiners in my year were Derek Davis, Don Harris, Francis, Brian Simpson, and Gunter Treitel. I had a viva, and I swear to you, it's the only time in my life I did this. We turned up at 9:30 to be told to come back later on. I went back to college, and I put on a very short skirt. It was the 60s, and I promise you, it's the only time I ever did it, and it worked. So I'm amazed and actually really quite emotional to find myself here. And I want to say belatedly thank you to Francis for examining me. Thank you to... thank you to Jeff Hackney, who always cheered us up. Thank you to Peter North, who, when I was a new tutor, took me on one side and said useful things like, Ruth, there's 8 weeks in the term and you've got to give them a reading list. Thank you to John Eekelaar, who said to me, Ruth, you've got to teach family law, which I haven't thought of doing. And of course, belatedly, thank you to Peter Carter. And of course, I'm so glad that Lorna is here. I hold the world record. I applied to Oxford and Cambridge women's colleges on 9 separate occasions over 3 years before I got in. And on the second interview by Peter Carter, on my final attempt, he said to me, Miss Frankel, you're here again. And I said, I'll be back next year if you don't take me. And he did take me, though I had a very sketchy academic record. And of course, that was a life-changing moment. And I hope he's up there, listening to us. He should be. Thank you.